Alright, chapter 12 is all about antebellum culture and reform. Antebellum refers to the period of time before the Civil War. Ante meaning before, like you ante up, and bellum referring to war like bellicose. If you're an angry, confrontational individual, you're bellicose. So antebellum culture and reform. And we're going to see some pretty interesting things come out of the United States during the years leading up to the Civil War. You have to remember, America is undergoing enormous change in the early 19th century. We're industrializing. The population is changing both in size and diversity. People are pushing further and further west. There's a lot of change going on. And so what we see is that people try to impose order on their lives. They try to find some way to control this chaos, and the methods they come up with to try and impose order and structure on society, some of them are pretty interesting. So we're going to look at new schools of thought, new philosophies that come out of the United States. We're going to talk about this search for perfection and how that affects the different reform movements of the day, especially, as we'll talk about last, the growing abolition movement. Okay. First of all, let's talk about Romanticism and Transcendentalism. Romanticism is a movement that starts in the 1800s, the 19th century. In many ways, Romanticism is a backlash or a counter to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and even to the growing industrialization. Remember what the Enlightenment taught us. Remember that Enlightenment thinkers thought that natural laws governed the world, governed the universe, and if humans could just discover those natural laws and apply them to our society, apply them to our lives, we could create a better society. So through the use of logic and reason, people could perfect their lives. Well, Romanticism is the exact opposite of that. Romanticism it's not about love. It's not romantic in that sense, but it's all about emotion. Okay, so in many ways, it is a backlash against the rationality and logic that people were insisting upon during the Enlightenment, during the scientific revolution. Instead of focusing on logic, people are focusing on emotion. Romanticism, this idea that every individual at heart is basically good, and that it's the job of society to nurture that goodness. All right, well, we will see that Romanticism will be present in many aspects of American culture, but you need to realize that America's reputation in the world in the 1800s, culturally speaking, is not that great. Most of the quote-unquote civilized world really regarded America as sort of the back edge of nowhere. We're a bunch of frontiersmen, we're a bunch of hillbillies, we're uncouth, we're unrefined. You know, we don't have anything to offer the world like, say, Paris or London, these cultural centers that have been cultural centers for centuries. Most of the well-heeled people of the world didn't really think that America has a whole lot to offer, culturally speaking. We're rough and tumble, we're not refined. Well, we're going to see that begin to change in the 1800s as America kind of grows to adopt this romantic movement. For example, the Hudson River School of Art. Now, this is not like a physical building. This is more like an art movement. The Hudson River School sought to portray the raw beauty of nature and to encourage people to commune with nature more often. For example, this is the Oxbow by Thomas Cole. And you can see there are no people in this painting. There are no artificial structures, no buildings, no fences, anything like that. It's just the raw beauty of nature. And if you notice, in this particular painting, you can see coming in from the left side these storm clouds. A lot of people have theorized that this painting in particular sort of symbolizes the confrontation between the artificial rules of society and the raw beauty of nature. This is Niagara Falls by Frederick Church. And again, there's nothing artificial about it. It's the raw beauty of nature. That's what they sought to celebrate. We also see Romanticism in literature. James Fenimore Cooper wrote the Leatherstocking Tales, which detailed the American experiences out west on the frontier, dealings with Native Americans, just frontier life in general. He also wrote The Last of the Mohicans. So in some ways, James Fenimore Cooper, sort of the action hero genre of American literature. And then again, you have Herman Melville, who of course wrote Moby Dick, the eternal struggle between Captain Ahab and his target of the great white whale. And again, remember that American society is all about the individual. So Captain Ahab's individual obsession with this great white whale, the bravery, the courage, the dedication of American individuals, but also tragedy as well, because of course, if you've ever read Moby Dick, you know that he never actually, he does not kill the whale. So, all right, Romanticism in literature. Now, out of Romanticism will come a uniquely American philosophy, Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, at its core, focuses on the differences between two things, the difference between reason and understanding. Reason is the innate ability. It's something you're born with. Reason is the innate ability to grasp truth and beauty and understanding through emotion. Again, it's all about this emotion rather than logic. Reason is your ability, your born-in ability to grasp truth and beauty through emotion. Understanding is learning the artificial rules that are imposed by society. Understanding is learning the artificial structure that society has imposed upon us. So, reason is using emotion to grasp truth and beauty. Understanding is learning the artificial rules handed down by society. And of course, as you might think, they wanted to cultivate reason and move away from understanding. This is Ralph Waldo Emerson. He is probably the leading transcendentalist. He's an American philosopher and poet. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, in particular, focused on people's ability to reach God. Now, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's view, God was everywhere. God was all around us. God was found everywhere in nature. So if you wanted to be closer to God, you should remove yourself from the artificial rules imposed by society and get back closer to nature. Again, it's all about your individual relationship with God. It's about your individual relationship with nature. Another leading transcendentalist is Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau is an American author, probably best known for his book Walden, in which he spends 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days living by Walden Pond. He removes himself from the hustle and bustle of everyday society. He moves out to the edge of town where he can be alone with his thoughts. And again, it's this idea, you moving away from the artificial rules imposed by society. Henry David Thoreau is also notable for really being the first person to begin the practice of civil disobedience, this idea of protesting laws that you find immoral or unjust. Henry David Thoreau was a committed abolitionist. He did not believe in slavery. And so he refused to pay his taxes because he theorized, I pay my taxes, that money goes to supporting the government, which supports slavery. I'm not going to do it anymore. So, okay. He was really the beginning of American civil disobedience. All right. Let's talk about utopian communities. As you probably know, utopia refers to a place of perfection, right? It's some paradise that is perfect. But the word actually means, if you look at the actual root meaning of the word, the suffix topia refers to a place or earth. For example, a topographical map refers to a map that shows the earth, or a topiary is a kind of plant, okay? But that prefix "u" in the Greek root actually means no. It means, so the word, if you read it as the Greek word, actually means no place or nowhere. So this utopia, this perfection, literally means is unattainable. All right, as I mentioned, the 1800s was a time of great reform. People are trying to make sense out of an imperfect world. So they try to reform society to something they think is better. And these reformed societies are known as the utopian communities. They are very popular, but they're sometimes also very radical. For example, most of these utopian communities revolve around the ideas of socialism and communism. The idea that, for example, people no longer have any private property. If you want to join one of these utopian communities, you are required to hand over all your private property to the community so they can use it as they see fit. Altered gender roles. Many times, traditional marriage is not part of these new communities. So, okay, they are different, they are radical, but they're a consequence of this very chaotic time that people are living in. They're trying to do what they can. There's lots of things in their lives they can't control. So the things they can control, they do try to reform to better fit their ideas of what society should be. One of these utopian communities are known as the Shakers. That's not their actual official name, and I can't remember what it is now. The United Church in Christ's Second Appearing, I want to say, is their official title, but they're much better known as the Shakers. And the reason they're known as the Shakers, it really begins as kind of a pejorative term. If you remember when we were talking about the Quakers, the actual name of the Quaker Church is the Society of Friends, but most people know them as Quakers. Kind of the same deal with the Shakers. They have an actual official name, but most people know them as the Shakers because of the elaborate dancing rituals they hold during their religious ceremonies. Shakers are probably the most financially successful of these utopian communities. They become very, very famous for their furniture, and even today, it's kind of similar to Amish furniture, very well built, very highly sought after, very expensive. And so even today, Shaker furniture, authentic Shaker furniture, is highly prized by collectors. But the actual Shakers themselves have some pretty unique ideas about religion. For example, they believe that God has a dual personality, that God encompasses both male and female. Most Christian communities refer to God in the masculine, right? He, him, his. Shakers did not necessarily believe that. They thought that God encompassed both male and female, and both sides are equal. And that's another pretty notable distinction about the Shakers, is that they believe that men and women are equal. Now, a lot of Christian churches at this time would have argued that men and women were spiritually equal, that their souls in the eyes of God would have been weighed equally. But here on earth, were men and women equal? No, of course not. Women can't vote. In many instances, women can't run businesses. They may not be able to own property in their own name. They're certainly under the guidance or thumb of whoever the male dominant figure in their life is, whether that's a husband or father or whatever. So the Shakers were really pretty unique that both they viewed males and females as being equal. Now, the other interesting thing about the Shakers is they also believed in complete separation. Other than these very elaborate dancing rituals that you see pictured here, outside of that, men and women led completely different lives, completely separate lives. The only time they saw each other was during their religious ceremonies. And so this is actually going to be a problem for the Shaker community because, the only way it can grow is through recruiting new members. There are no little Shakers being born. And so eventually the Shaker movement is going to die out. Another utopian community is the Oneida community. In many ways, the exact opposite of the Shaker community, because instead of strict separation, they practiced what was known as complex marriage. Every man was married to every woman, and every woman was married to every man. And the reason that they operated this way was that they believed that exclusive property, whether that's private property, your land, your belongings, your material wealth, and even exclusive affections were dangerous because it led to jealousy, it led to violence, it led to problems. So therefore, everyone pooled their property together. Again, that's sort of the idea behind living in a commune. Everyone gives all that they can and they take what they need. That's sort of the central tenet of socialism, each according to their ability, each according to their need. And that include even personal relationships. Now, eventually the Oneida community is going to become even more radical. They begin experimenting with eugenics. Eugenics is it's regarded as a science at the time. It's a science that is very popular in the United States during the 1800s, even into the early 1900s. Eugenics is the idea, essentially, it is selective breeding for humans. You know, in agriculture, in order to create the perfect specimen of, say, cows, you take the cows with the best characteristics, the biggest, healthiest cows, and you breed them together, hoping that their genetic offspring will combine both of their characteristics. Well, eventually somebody said, if we do this with cows and with horses and with other livestock, why can't we apply this same concept to human beings? And so eugenics is the idea selective breeding can produce the perfect human being. And again, it's very, very popular in the United States during the and worldwide during the mid to late 1800s, moving into the 1900s. Several very well-respected people believe in the idea of eugenics. So it kind of sounds crazy to us today, this idea that you can create the perfect human through breeding. But this was something taken very, very seriously during the 19th century. Another group we're not going to spend a lot of time on right now, we'll talk more about them later, the Mormons. No, maybe not necessarily a utopian community, but definitely an offshoot religious community that begins in the 1800s. And of course, as you probably know, the Mormon community came under persecution for some of their different religious beliefs. Of course, the early Mormon church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, believed in polygamy, the idea that a man could take more than one wife. So they were driven from their founding lands. Joseph Smith and later Brigham Young led them west until eventually, of course, they reached Salt Lake City, which is the center of Mormon faith today. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Mormons later on. Let's talk about religion and reform. Because we will see, and as you might expect, even though these utopian groups were pretty popular, they were not embraced by everybody. Utopian groups, pretty radical, the idea that you have to give up all your private property, the idea that you have to accept these altered gender roles. Not everyone is willing to buy into that way of life. So what we see much more typical are the quote-unquote traditional reforms. These things that people have been fighting for years at this point. For example, the temperance movement. The temperance movement is going to continue to grow and become stronger. This movement to limit or moderate alcohol. But the thing that happens, and this is important, the thing that happens as we move into the mid-1800s is that these reform groups are going to seize on the idea of perfection. And what they meant by this was that no human being is perfect, right? Nobody's ever going to be perfect. And what that essentially means is that we are capable of infinite improvement. We're never going to be perfect, so we can always get a little bit better. So we have to set the bar high. We have to aim for perfection. Even if we can't achieve perfection, if we aim for perfection, we can continually improve ourselves because there's always room to grow. And when they apply this idea of perfection to these traditional reform movements, we see that they take these traditional reform movements to the extreme. For example, temperance. the movement to moderate or limit alcohol becomes a crusade to completely ban alcohol. So they take this idea of perfection and they take it to the extreme. We're no longer worried just about moderating alcohol. Now we want to get rid of it altogether. Abolition. Abolition changes from maybe gradual manumission, maybe from limiting the expansion of slavery but allowing it to continue where it already was. It changes from that to complete emancipation all at once. So they take this idea of perfection, this idea of the extreme radical view, and they apply it and begin to work towards that. And as you might imagine, some reformers are going to be met with hostility. Turns out people don't want to give up their alcohol. Slave owners don't want to give up their slaves. So as they begin to stress the extreme ideas of these reform movements, not everyone's going to be on board with those either. And again, it's this age-old question that the United States has to struggle with. The choice between order and social structure and personal freedom. Because the more freedom you have, the less structure you have. And the more order you have, the more laws you have governing the behavior of individuals, the less personal freedom you have. And again, this is something that the United States has struggled with since day one. And eventually people are going to latch onto the idea of institutional order, that through certain institutions you can reform people to sort of fit into the perfect molds created by society. For example, the public school system becomes much larger during the 1800s. It's during the mid to late 1800s, moving into the 1900s, that public schooling in the United States really begins to take off. And the idea was that you can create the perfect people needed by an orderly society by putting them through school. You know, it's kind of this cookie cutter mentality. That if everybody goes through school and everybody's taught the same way and everybody comes out of school acting the same way, that will lead to more social order. Same idea with asylums. If you have somebody that does not conform to the expectations of society, whether that's through mental illness or maybe they just march to the beat of their own drummer, you know, whatever it is, if you can institutionalize them, if you can put them through an asylum, maybe that will change their behavior to something that is acceptable by society. So, you know, in the choice between order and personal freedom, in the mid to late 1800s, people really came down more on the side of order than personal freedom. Let's talk a little bit more about abolitionism, because that is going to, of course, be a very important growing movement. And, of course, anti-slavery sentiments are not new. Ever since before there was the United States, people have been speaking out against slavery. But here's the idea, and this is something that I want you to understand. You can be a racist and you can be an abolitionist. The two things are not mutually exclusive. Because, and here's why, a lot of abolitionists believed that slaves deserved to be free, but they were not necessarily fit to participate in American society. So you're against slavery, but the opinion of African Americans were that they were not fit to participate in American society. So they still have a pretty dim view of black people, even if they were against the institution of slavery. So the idea was, if they deserve to be free, but they can't operate in American society, what are they going to do? Well, they need to go create their own society, this idea of colonization. And colonization attempts are pretty popular. The American Colonization Society tries to set these up. Probably the most famous example is Liberia, which is a country on the coast of Africa. And the idea was you free slaves, you ship them back to Africa, you give them the tools and the supplies they need to start their own society, and there you go. We can get rid of slavery by transporting the slaves back to their homeland of Africa. The problem, of course, with this is that many slaves, by this point, we're talking about the mid-1800s, probably the vast majority of slaves by this point were born in the United States. They don't know any other life other than the United States. And so the idea that they're going to be completely willing to uproot their lives, travel across the ocean to a brand new continent, and start a brand new society from scratch, that really is not feasible. And these colonization attempts and this colonization fervor does die out over time, because we will see that the abolition movement itself actually loses strength. Remember that the institution of slavery begins to lose strength over time, because as the movement away from tobacco and indigo and rice, these traditional southern cash crops, there weren't as many slaves needed until, of course, King Cotton. And once Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin and cotton begins to spread through the South, that is what's going to revitalize slavery, and of course later it's also going to revitalize the abolition movement. It really begins to pick up steam in the 1830s with William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, seen here, is an editor of an anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. Now, William Lloyd Garrison is a militant abolitionist. He doesn't believe in the gradual emancipation of slaves. He doesn't believe in this gradual colonization of slaves. He wants to end slavery for everyone yesterday, okay? He is a militant abolitionist. But he has a new view on slavery that is actually pretty unique to him. Previously, abolitionists had focused on the harmful effects of slavery on white society. Now think about that for a second. A lot of the abolitionists who are arguing against slavery argue against slavery because they think that it's harmful to white society. And they point to the South as an example. They say, look, the South is not industrializing. The South is not growing. The South is stagnant. The South is backward because of slavery. The argument is that slavery made white society lazy. Well, William Lloyd Garrison was one of the first people to focus on the harmful effect on black people. He was saying, who cares about what it does to white society? Slavery is bad because it's immoral, it's unjust to the slaves. And that seems almost ridiculous to us, that they would focus on the harmful effects to white society rather than to the actual slaves themselves. But Garrison was really one of the first people to say slavery is wrong for what it does to black people. So this is really a pretty revolutionary idea, but as it turns out, it's a pretty popular idea, because we will see thousands of people flock to his banner, take up this militant abolitionism that he is preaching. We also see freed slaves take part in this debate, probably the most famous of which is Frederick Douglass, who is a freed slave who goes on to be a major abolitionary movement leader. And again, this fight against slavery and racism are two very different things. While some people, maybe even a lot of people, might be willing to argue that slaves deserved to be free, very few people in the North or the South were willing to agree that they were the equal of white people. To be freed from slavery didn't necessarily make you an equal in white society. And of course, there is deep-set resistance to abolitionism. Throughout the South, of course, people argued that abolitionism wasn't just a fight against slavery, it was a fight against their very way of life. And so a lot of people in the South violently react to abolitionism. And then, of course, we have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which was a runaway bestseller in the North because it was a fictional book, but it seemed to confirm the evils of slavery. Uncle Tom was a loyal, obedient slave, and every time he turned around, his life was made worse and worse by these cruel white owners. Like I said, it was a runaway bestseller in the North, and Harriet Beecher Stowe was burned in effigy throughout the South. So again, it really shows the pretty radical reactions and the extremely different reactions between the North and South, and that this wedge is growing wider between these two sections. I want to talk about feminism for a second, because the early feminist movement is actually going to be an offshoot of the abolition movement. As we've mentioned before, women are going to be some of the leading reformers, because that was the one area of society that was acceptable for them. They can't really lead the church, they can't really participate in politics, but they can be reformers. So women are going to make up most of the early reformers, including the early abolitionists, such as the Quaker sisters. The Quaker community was one of the staunchest fighters against slavery in the antebellum United States. As a whole, the Quaker community denounced the practice of slavery. Well, eventually, some of these women reformers are going to realize that as they were fighting for freedom and equality for the slaves, they didn't have those rights and freedoms themselves. So that, for example, the Quaker sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, they begin speaking for universal freedom and equality, not just for slaves, but for women as well. We see Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the first feminist convention in the United States, the Seneca Falls Convention, which actually was nearly held in Canada because nobody in the United States was willing to rent a convention hall to women. Now, at the last moment, they did find a place to hold it, but that just goes to show you the first feminist convention in the United States was actually nearly held in Canada because women didn't have the right to rent spaces on their own. At the Seneca Falls Convention, they published what's known as the Declaration of Sentiments, which is based very closely on the Declaration of Independence of the United States, except instead of crimes against the colonies by the king, they talk about crimes against women by men. And they're talking not only about the slavery of race, they talk about the slavery of sex. And of course, they're referring to marriage, that when a woman becomes married, she is just as, they weren't regarded as private property, obviously, but she was just as controlled by her husband as a slave was controlled by their master. So the early feminist movement is going to be an offshoot, and actually in many ways it will splinter the abolition movement because a lot of the other abolitionists, especially men, may not have agreed with the feminist movement, and so we will see that the abolition movement over time is going to splinter and fracture some off into the feminist movement in the United States. Okay.